I would first of all like to say that it's an enormous pleasure for me and Dr. Bertola to be able to work with you during the next 2 days. It's also an enormous pleasure for us to be in your country. It's the first visit to this country, and we enjoy it a lot, in particular the very good-natured and welcoming people that seem to be everywhere in this country. Why do we want to give a course in conservation biology, and can you do it in 2 days? Let's start with the latter question. You can't do it in 2 days. So what I'm going to do is give you a hard time. You have to work hard. I also will do this together. And what we try to do is give you a survey about theory and tools to do conservation biology. So that's important, we feel. But also we feel that if you do that for 2 days only, you can just scratch the surface of all what's there in the scientific literature on the subject. And so that's a pity. So it's our first visit, but we hope to be back. As Cas said, you are the future, and we are old hands. And so, oh, he didn't say that, but he is. And our ideal would be if we can train some of you to do science in conservation biology. And so it would be very nice if we could collaborate to set up a full master program so that we don't have 2 days, but 2 years to achieve what we want. It's worth doing it. Why do you need a discipline which is called conservation biology? Why couldn't it just be biology? And the reason is that there are all sorts of problems of human impact. And we'll go through that for a while, just to let you understand how the problem is, what sort of problems there are, and how we could maybe start to deal with it. And then in later lectures, we'll go through theory and methods. So we'll start very simple. And I must warn you that if you think it's too simple, it will get more difficult. So let's first define biodiversity. Most people think in species when they talk biodiversity, but that's not enough. Biodiversity you can define on all levels, from the molecular level, the genetic level, to complete ecosystems. And that's important because a species, which is an important level of biodiversity, can only exist when there are certain conditions of its population size and genetic variation, as I will show later. So let's look at genetic variation. So here you see the snails of a single species, which is quite common in Europe. And you see that there are many different color varieties and that there are many varieties in terms of the number of black bands they have. And these have all been collected at a single place. And we know the genetics, so we can safely say that there is a lot of genetic variation in these populations. But most genetic variation is hidden. If you see a herd of deer, well, maybe you can distinguish males and females, but they all look the same. And that's because there's one ideal form for a deer, and that's why evolution is working, and it's called stabilizing selection, to have all the animals look the same. But there is also hidden in their genes a lot of genetic variation, and as I'll show later, this is really needed. Of course, the species level. Here you see a variety of tree frogs all collected in one tropical forest. That's really amazing. And it brings up all sorts of questions. How is it possible that they coexist? Why are there so many species? And what's the function of all those species? We'll go to those questions. And then at the highest level you have the ecosystem. And the ecosystem is sort of a home to the diversity. And so here you see an aerial photograph of an ecosystem in the northern part of the USA, the northwestern part. And what you see is that you have a patchwork of forest, grasslands, and marshes. And all the watery areas are very well to see on the false color picture at the right, which shows the same area. So those are the levels of biodiversity. They all matter. And later in the lectures, we'll revisit them all at some point. But in general, you use, because it's easy to do, you use very often species diversity as a sort of a shortcut to biodiversity. And so then you look at the number of species. But just the number of species doesn't give you a good idea of the diversity in the local area. So we need something more. And this is called, we need a measure for evenness. And what I mean by that, I will show in the next graph. So this is a theoretical community, and it consists, or there are two, and we compare them. And they consist out of 100 individuals. And the blue ones, there the community consists of 5 species. And so and what you see is that there are 20 animals or plants or whatever they are in each species. 20 individuals per species. That's a very even distribution of the individuals over the species. And so the other graph shows that there are 92 individuals in one species and only 4 times 2 in the other 4 species. And so both communities have 5 species, but we tend to say that the more even community has a higher diversity. And so you have to keep that in mind. You always have to think about numbers. And that has also a function. Here you see a forest, and in the upper picture you see trees that are doomed because there's a pathogen that kills them. And they're all of one species because it's a species-specific pathogen. And so these trees die, and then it's easy to imagine that what's left over you could hardly call a forest. You see some scattered trees. Whereas in the second picture, where the evenness is much higher, if that one species disappears, you still have a decent forest and it looks quite diverse, although you've lost one of the species. So evenness is also something that has a meaning in the terms of stability of the ecosystem. Oh, sorry. Some places have a bewildering diversity, and an example of that is the number of fish species in the East African lakes. And here you see a picture of different fish from Lake Malawi. And the interesting thing here is they all belong to the same family, but so there is one common ancestor which has led in the end to the evolution of many different species that all have different jobs in the ecosystem. You see predators that live in the open water, you see animals that live on the rocks, you see animals that are scrapers, you see animals that are insect feeders, And if you would have a little bit more knowledge about these fish, you could recognize them from the form of their mouth. But we are not going to lecture on fish, so we continue. What I want to say about such a lake is that it's a unique place on Earth, and a single place on Earth that has biodiversity is vulnerable because there's no replicate of that diversity elsewhere. So let's now look at a much larger scale. Biologists, they have estimated that there are at least 10 million different species on Earth. And that we talk only about animals, of multicellular animals, because if we would add bacteria and fungi, we would end up even higher, much higher. Species of insects in a tropical forest in the Amazon have led to even much higher estimates. And people think, if that's true for the rest of the world, that there would be as many as 30 million species. So that's quite a diversity. But there is something very sad about this bewildering number of species. There are too many species to study. It would take the whole world population of biologists, if they could work for a century, to describe all the unknown species. And so there's a lot that we don't know. These are estimates, they're extrapolations, and the number of described species is actually only a fraction of what a real diversity in the world is. And that's very sad for other reasons. At this moment, people are cutting the Amazon forest at a very high rate. We know that species go extinct, but now they're also going extinct many species that we even don't know. And so there's the problem. We have, during the last 50 years, lost up to 20%. And the other thing is that evolution continues. So at this moment, there are also processes going on that create new species. But in most cases, evolution works slow. So the rate at which new species evolve is much lower than the rate at which we make species disappear. And so that's why it's important to think about conservation biology. Now, there are people, and you'll meet them and you have to discuss with them. They say, well, of course, there are a lot of species going extinct, but most of those species aren't useful for mankind anyway. And also in the past we had huge extinctions, even larger extinctions, and the world has recovered from that. So don't worry, go on in exploiting nature, make money. And so we have to see what's the difference there. Now those large extinctions, you can see here a graph that shows how in time there's a lot of variation in extinction. But you look at, in this case, geological time. So there's always a speciation rate that compensates it again. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the current extinction is caused by humans. So we are responsible. And we do not know the effect on our world of getting all those species extinct. And so here is a really important problem. So one of the things I want to do in this course is show you that biodiversity is needed. We'll get there later. Now back to a definition. There are a lot of species that are not yet extinct, and we call them threatened or endangered. And when the last animal dies, we call it extinction. It's interesting to ask yourself, what makes that a particular species goes extinct? So what makes a species vulnerable to extinction? Now at this moment, there are animals and plants introduced from one continent into another. And that means that organisms that haven't co-evolved together meet. And there sometimes you have dramatic consequences. So a species could be very vulnerable to the arrival of an introduced species, either because the introduced species competes the local species away, or because it's a predator and it eats the local species away. So that's an important thing. And then there are, of course, other things. We exploit nature. We catch fish in the ocean and we eat it. And we cannot stop doing that. It's called overexploitation, and it drives animals to extinction. And then there are animals that are already rare. And so those are vulnerable to extinction. And then how do we do it? If we don't do it by over-expectation, we do it by taking their space. We destroy their habitats because we want to use the space for ourselves. Now here's an example. There was a small red kangaroo in Australia that is now extinct because people decided, well, they had done all sorts of stupid things. One thing they had done, they had introduced rabbits to Australia, and those exploded in numbers and were a nuisance. And then they said, well, we need to repair that, so let's introduce foxes. And then they introduced the foxes, and then the foxes didn't solve the rabbit problem, but the red kangaroo went to extinction because the whole population was eaten by foxes. Now, overexploitation. I think at this moment, one of the best examples is the blue tuna. Japanese have an enormous fondness for this animal when they find it on their plate, not when it swims in the ocean. And so they will exploit it to the last individual. The reason is that I once saw that in Tokyo at 5 o'clock in the morning at an auction where they were selling these tuna. You can make $10,000 for a single tuna. That's a lot of money. So that is an incentive to catch the last living tuna. And there are electronic companies now that buy tuna and they store it in big freeze houses to make money later. They sell it when nature has nothing to offer anymore. So and then this is what happens to the population. You see it crash, and you see that the expectation was that it would go extinct last year. Let's be positive, there's still some. Overexploitation in particular is a problem for animals that reproduce slowly. Generally, they are big animals, so we're losing big animals. And here's an example of African elephants that have been killed to get their tusks. Well, rarity we already touched. When you're rare, you're vulnerable to stochastic processes, and we'll come back to that. And that makes that being rare for other reasons, maybe because you're a specialist, makes also that you can go easily extinct. Well, species can be rare in different ways. As with the tuna I've shown, you can become rare because of overexploitation or because humans have destroyed your habitat. And some other animals, like the freshwater dolphin, they are rare because they have a very local occurrence. And so now the hydrological system of the Ganges has become polluted, and so this animal is on the way out. Finally, there is habitat loss and fragmentation, and that's in particular important for animals that live in forests, because we cut a lot of forests. So the red panda, the proboscis monkey, they could be victims of that. The maned wolf is also an example, but it is also hunted, and its habitat is getting smaller and smaller. And so it used to be a very common animal, and now it's very rare. And it's really at an enormous rate that we are destroying the environment. Here you have a map of the forests in Madagascar. And you see the years. Within half a century, we have removed 90% of all the forest. 90%. And if it was only on Madagascar, it would already be a shame. But look at Central America. Same story. And then on a smaller scale, here you see what used to be a forest in southern Australia. And what you see is there are only little specks and dots of forest left. And we'll discuss about the problems it gives for animals if their habitat has become fragmented. And then finally, there are other reasons why animals are disappearing. Global warming is one of them, and we are now absolutely certain that it's caused by man. And pollution is, of course, another one. So let's get some figures. So I said about 20% of all living organisms is going to disappear during the next 30 years if we don't do anything. And it would be more than half by the end of this century. And then you see that there are really significant numbers of all the plant species, of the butterflies, and of the birds. And then for many other groups, we don't have figures, we don't know. These are all spectacular animals which are easy to count, and there are many that because we know only a small fraction of their species. So we're sure that the decline in biodiversity is due to us, and that it has been much more rapid during the last 50 years than before, although we had already started in the 17th century. And so it's really very, very alarming. And here again I show some of the animals that have gone extinct, maybe not during your lifetime, but some of them have gone extinct during my lifetime. So at the left you see this is the Tasmanian wolf, and then you see again the red kangaroo, you see the ivory woodpecker, and the dodo, which was already made extinct by humans in the 17th century. Now, why are we doing that? Because we all agree that it's something terrible and it should stop, and we're doing it. And so of this first introductory lecture, this is the most important message I'm going to give. There is a theory which is called the tragedy of the commons, which I'll explain in a minute. But before I have to explain you what the word the commons, what it means. And it is that in Europe and in the USA, in the past, and maybe here still, villages are surrounded by common grazing ground for the cattle. So every villager is entitled to let his cows or sheep graze on that land. And now, of course, if the animals eat away more grass than there grows per unit of time, then you talk about overexploitation. And you should prevent that. The whole village should realize that the commons should be in good shape, and therefore the whole village should take its responsibility and not let too many animals graze on the commons. And what happens then is that I'm a villager, and I'm quite clever. And so I go to this meeting where we all decide everybody is allowed 10 cows, not more. And I nod my head and I say, yes, we do that. And then I go home, and then the next day I put 12 cows on the commons. By agreeing for 10 and hoping that my neighbors will be nice people and do 10, there will be more for me. At the end of the year I have 12 cows and they only 10. I produce more milk, more meat, etc. So I'm doing myself a favor. And the price I'm paying for it is only small, because my 2 cows extra, well, they give a marginal effect of overexploitation, but not visible for my neighbor, so who cares? Now and then, of course, my neighbor who sees that I'm putting out 12 cows, he thinks, well, let me also put out 12 cows. And that's the tragedy of the commons. So it is depletion of a shared resource by individuals that act independently and rational. So they're rational decisions. But the effect, of course, is that it goes wrong. So it's in the individual's best interest to do that, but for the community it's something bad, because overexploitation leads to something like this. The commons have been overexploited, there's hardly grass growing. And the reason that they do it is that they gain more by trespassing the laws they made. And they pay very little on the short term, but somebody is paying. The neighbors who are not doing the same, they are paying for it because their cows will be meager and they won't produce a lot of milk. That's one bad thing. But the worst thing is that the costs, they are in the future. So what we are doing together, because we are not villagers, we are world citizens, and together we are over-exploiting the world, and we make it a bad world for our children and grandchildren. Because by that time, so they pay the costs for what we are doing. And that's a very important reason to conserve nature and to think about conservation biology. Well, here's an example of the tragedy of the commons. The air is nobody's, and so now we all have to breathe dust in Kathmandu because the air is of a hopelessly bad quality. We will live shorter, we will die because we get all sorts of illnesses. And who's responsible? We all. Now, the last slide of this first lecture, and then this may be the most important one, because here we can start of thinking. Now we know how it works. We know that the reason we overexploit the world is because there is this tragedy of the common thing. We understand that people doing rationally the best for themselves are not dealing with the future and not in the interest of the whole world. And so, knowing that, it's obvious that once you have something which belongs to everybody, the commons, the oceans, the air, that you have to do something about it. Now, one way would be that we would parcel out the air and the oceans and the grazing land and the forests, and that all these parcels would be privately owned. Because then managing your own parcel would be in your own interest. And so then you would maybe realize that you shouldn't overexploit it. Well, that's more easily said than done. And it's a solution. Sometimes it's a solution. But it's, in general, not a solution when we talk about nature. And so there's another solution, and the other solution is that there must be some power, a government, they must make laws and to prevent the tragedy of the commons and to make sure that these laws are obeyed. There must be punishments. There are also intermediate things. You could say, well, we make a national park and we have guards there and they look at whether everybody is keeping within the frontiers of the law. That's okay. But at the same time, with natural parks, you could say, well, maybe if the park, the maintenance of the park, would also be in the interest of the people that surround it, it could help to maintain it. And so sometimes you can let people not overexploit, but harvest things in the forest, so that's in their interests. So you have to think about these things. You have to think about how we can circumvent the tragedy of the commons. I hope that this will help you also in discussing with non-biologists about nature and things like that. And here I like to stop and I like to break for 15 minutes and you can do whatever you want, but one of the things you could also do, because I will be available, is ask me questions. And you're really invited to do so.
I have is this, okay? A rational self-interest would dictate that we curb overconsumption. And having lived in the USA for longest time, the world wants to overconsume. Economic growth means overconsumption, overproduction, overconsumption. Whereas the rational interest would call that we curb the consumption to a reasonable level. So my question is actually pointed towards the solution. The solution for numerous different causes is actually controlling consumption the way I see it, and it is direct contradiction with the economic growth. So can we have some insight in the solution? That is the question.
I agree with you, but the problem is that the ghost of the tragedy of the commons comes up if you want to implement what you're doing. Again, you will run against the wall of self-interest of people who still think that by letting the other people overexploit, overconsume, that they themselves would become better. So again, I think you need laws and regulations to reach your goal, but you're right.
You have mentioned two different extremes of the solutions. That's one, privately owning, to the nationalization and national parks. As you are also aware, the community participation and community forestry and buffer zones, which is I would say, intermediate in between, which is being considered one of the successful approach of conservation of the biodiversity, including the rational use of the resources also.
Yeah, I pointed to that when I said that you can also let people, for instance, exploit the forest for fruits or medicines in a way that they're not going to overexploit, destroy the forest. You're absolutely right. And I wanted, by putting these two very extreme solutions there, to provoke you into discussion, and I'm glad I succeeded.